My name is Dr. Bill Silcock. I'm the curator of the Hubert H. Humphrey program at Arizona State University's Walter Cronkite School, but I'm also a journalist. I'm a journalism educator. I'm director of Cronkite Global Initiatives at the Cronkite School at Arizona State. It's a great question. Whether or not we're trying to adapt or change, ultimately they're the same thing, because we're going to have to figure out how to be stronger, more ethical, more honest, but more accurate journalists in this new media environment that we're working in. Across the global media landscape, there are apps that come out every day, new types of techniques for telling stories. We've talked this week about Instagram and Pinterest and Facebook and Twitter and even a new one called Periscope. But 6 months from now, 2 years from now, there'll be a whole new slew of applications that allow us to tell stories better. The challenge is keeping the tradition alive of accuracy, being ethical, being truthful, being fair and balanced. In the world that's increasingly driven by visuals, today's journalism is visually driven. It's so easy for me to take a picture on my phone and share it instantly across social platforms. But so can the citizen, and so can the terrorist. And so what that means is journalists have to be wiser in how they use the tools, and also smarter in how they educate the audience about these tools. Traditionally, there has been what's called a firewall between the news department and advertising and marketing, this boundary between them. Social media allows us to go across the boundary quickly and more differently than we ever imagined possible. But that just means a rethink on the part of the journalists back to some fundamental principles. Plus, it also means the owners, the leaders, the editors of news organizations have to sit down with their reporters and have some very honest discussions about what constitutes advertising and what constitutes journalism. Hopefully, there's a set of ethical codes inside these organizations that include in their ethical codes a strong point about you don't tell a story because somebody's just paid you to do it. That there's no payola or free gifts that are given for the privilege of doing journalism. That nobody can buy a story. That still is totally unethical, totally not allowed. Although in social media's world, it's easier to do it, and it's also easier to cloud what's being done. It might look like a tweet, but actually it's a sponsored tweet. Or it might look like a Facebook post, but maybe somebody's paid you to do that. So the key is solid ethical principles and transparency. And ultimately, it ends for each journalist themselves to have their own personal code of ethics. And it's through that personal code they can make sure that they maintain their integrity, which is so important for the future growth of journalism in Serbia or around the world. I'm extremely satisfied with the outcome of this workshop. One thing that's so important is not only do they hear the perspective of myself, an American professor who's still a practicing journalist, but as you can see behind me, they're hearing the perspective of someone who's right here in Niš, who's speaking their language literally and can explain about applications and processes in ways that I can't quite get across. However, the English has been very good. We've had excellent translators provided by the Media Center here in Niš, and that's allowed us to experiment a little bit with new social media platforms, try things out, and the journalists have been excellent at being willing to try something new. 3 days ago, some of them weren't even on Twitter, and they thought it was foolish and stupid to be. They've changed their opinion, and now they're on Twitter. They've found that Facebook is applicable not only just for sharing with friends and family, but actually an important feed for telling contemporary stories. We've looked at the power of pictures on social media applications, and they've gone out onto the streets of Niš and taken photographs and interviewed citizens to see what they think of the social media and how social media is changing journalism. And that's probably the most important thing, is to be in touch with the audience, not just to be in a workshop pondering the mysteries of journalism, but actually be out in the streets and figure out what the people want, what the people need, and then with those two answers you come back and say, okay, here's what I can provide for them. Here's the boundaries of my ability as a journalist. I think journalists very much are like doctors, and we have what's called the Teaching Model Hospital for Journalism Education at the Walter Cronkite School. So we're trying new techniques to improve journalism so that society can get better. Now there's citizens out there that also are using phones to share stories. They're called citizen journalists, but they're not trained doctors. They're not trained journalists. And we're always going to need those trained journalists in order to make sure truth isn't sacrificed. It's always hard to predict the future, and I would be a fool to try. But one thing I do know that's going to happen is fundamentally the way to tell stories is going to get better and better. It's going to become more media rich. And the future, certainly with cloud technology, with smartphone technology, with what other new applications come along, are going to allow us to be able to tell those stories in new and important ways for the future. One of the things that will impact the future of journalism that already has impacted it is what's called so-called data journalism, which are big databases of information. The governments, whether it's the United Nations, the US government, the government of Serbia, has gathered lots of information on citizens, and they do it through the internet. That information needs to be available to journalists to process. But in order to do that, they're very complex data sets. So the future is about journalists mining the data, as they call it, figuring out applications to help them understand what stories are being told that's buried in all that statistical information. There'll be a lot of surprises in that information. Then the other thing that will happen is, I think, continually the desire for citizens to participate, to be engaged, has fundamentally flipped what we know about journalism. Information used to be scarce, now information is rich. We have so much information. Journalists have changed their role. They used to be the watchdog on the press. They still are. They used to be the gatekeeper deciding what stories entered into a newscast or into a newspaper. They still are. But the final new role that they will need to take on, and they need to figure out how to do that, is that as an educator. Journalists have to teach the people how to use these technologies because the government's using the technologies. So journalists have to help the people understand what the government's doing so that they're not fooled, and that they can make informed citizens so that democracy can thrive.